Um, when we are learning, when it comes to halacha in general, we always assume that there is a responsibility. There's a factor, an element of obedience, where the halacha says what it says, and we have an obligation to do what the halacha says. And then there is a value that exists behind the halacha. There's a reason why we do it. We generally, when we look at it, we don't assume that we have agency to decide whether the value, the obligation to perform the halacha is absolute. It's not like we say, well, here's the value, and then we apply it kind of selectively. Or if we do that, we shouldn't be doing that. We assume that that's supposed to exist basically across the board. The question that we'd like to explore here is how that plays out in terms of, that issue plays out in terms of the question of men and women in terms of the contacts and restrictions that have been described here. And the place I'd like to start is by just going back to this Rambam and Tur that we spoke about a couple of times last week and the week before that. We had mentioned that the Shulchan Aruch is based on the Tur, and the Tur basically starts with Tzarich Adam litrachek min hanashim me'od me'od, that a man is supposed to separate from a woman, from women me'od me'od, very, very much, and that's one kind of distinguishing factor of the way that the Tur structures it. And the second is that while we've talked about kind of hierarchies of, well, what does the Torah prohibit, and what did the rabbis prohibit, and what is it that's considered a capital crime, and what is a lo taseh from the Torah, and what is just something that the Gemara said. The Tur basically didn't make the distinctions. He just kind of brought all of those things together and said, women and men are supposed to be separate. And the ways that women and men are supposed to be separate include lots of practices. They include, obviously, not having sex in inappropriate context, but it also includes not hugging and kissing. It also includes a man not watching the woman when she's doing laundry in the river, as the Gemara mentioned. Now, those examples are very different in terms of how severe they seem, but when the Tur quotes them, he quotes them in categories and kind of overarching categories, but puts them all together. And what's lost in that structure is a kind of a hierarchical formation that the Rambam is actually very committed to. As the Rambam, when the Rambam wrote his Mishnah Torah, one of the things that was most kind of decisive about it was that he wanted to organize it in a very specific kind of way, and what the 14 books were through which he organized the Mishnah Torah is very important, and how he placed different categories were very important. And then not only where he put specific categories of law are significant, but also how he ordered the halachot within those categories also became very important. So just to go back to something that we had mentioned a couple of weeks ago, these rules about interaction between men and women could be placed in different areas in terms of the book that the Rambam chose. There is a sefer called Hilchot Nashim, which is about the interactions between men and women, and the Rambam did not put these halachot there. He focused there on marriage and divorce and married life. He put these rules in a book called Sefer Kedusha, and Kedusha means separating off, and the Rambam says the reason why these rules are written in Sefer Kedusha, a book of sanctity, which is because these are the categories. What's within this Sefer are the things that should separate us from the nations of the world. And in that setting, he included three categories: one of Isurei Bia, which has to do with sexual matters, and two that have to do with food. Machalot Asurot, the things were prohibited from eating, and Hilchot Shchita, the rules of Shchita. And from that hierarchy, you see that the Rambam is saying, through his structure, he's kind of communicating an idea. And the idea that he's communicating is that there is an overarching communal value that is expressed through these rules, which is the Jewish people should have, as a people, a sexual ethic that is different and distinguishable from the sexual ethic that is common in the societies that surround. That kind of largest idea then gets played out continually. I mean, if there is a kind of an overarching structure, I want to take a moment to pay attention to then the internal structure. The overarching structure is, if the overarching structure suggests an idea, then the internal structure suggests an idea as well. So if we turn to the Rambam here at the top, it's Hilchot Yisrei Biyah, Perek Kaf Aleph. So we know now that Yisrei Biyah is a part of that larger idea of Kedusha, which is about separating the Jewish people in terms of these issues. We note that the rules that we're talking about here is in Perek Kaf Aleph. Simply by the number, you can tell that this is not the beginning. It's not what he's starting Hilchot Yisrei Biyah with. It's the 21st chapter of Yisrei Biyah. There are actually 22 chapters in Hilchot Yisrei Biyah, so it's the next to last one. The one that, the topic of the 22nd chapter of Yisrei Biyah is the rules of Yichud, that men and women shouldn't be alone together. The reason why, what the Rambam does when he structures these, the way he structures the halachot, is that he wants to emphasize the things that are of primary importance and the things that derive from the Torah, and then he kind of moves along. And so he's preserving a certain kind of hierarchy, which is, what did the Torah tell me? What did the rabbis tell me? And in that sense, it actually kind of conveys a theological structure, which is, what did we get from God and what were the rabbis' interpretations of the rules? But he also conveys certain values in so doing. So if we, with our having those ideas in mind, which is these rules are in Sefer Kedusha, it is Yisrei Biyah is in Sefer Kedusha. We're in Perek Kaf Aleph of that, which means there's kind of a lot of backdrop to this already. Now, and presumably he's already prohibited the things that are going to help create that society is when individuals engage in sexual activity and when they don't. So in the context of marriage, it's appropriate. Outside the context of marriage, it's inappropriate. With certain people, it's inappropriate. And he's gone through that for 20 chapters. And those are kind of the keys to structuring the society. Then it gets increasingly kind of distant from the action and distant from the interaction between the man and the woman in terms of kind of layers of prohibition. So if the act is the most significant, then he kind of keeps on pulling back in terms of structuring the layers of prohibition, and that is very important to him. So halachot Aleph and Bet are these interpersonal actions. Kol ha'ba'al erva min ha'arayot derech evarim, o shechibek v'nashak derech ta'ava. If there is this a sexual interaction that is not actual intercourse, but is intimacy of another sort. Hareze lo kemin Torah shenemar lo tiasad mechukot ha'toivot v'nemar lo tikru galot erva. So you see again, just to remind what we said in the past, that establishing that kind of connection, if the act itself is the major issue, establishing the connection is a secondary but still divinely prohibited issue. And then Halacha Bet talks about interpersonal behaviors that are not quite explicitly written in the Torah. If you do stuff, if you do one of those actions that's described here, then you're not trusted in these manners. But then if you look at Halacha Bet and get a sense for how this takes one small step back, it's not a sexual act, it's something that leads to the sexual act, but it's not something that leads to the sexual act that is physical contact. It's not physical contact, but still communicative. That is not written in the Torah, like the first halacha, explicitly, and therefore it's not an isur deoraita, but it is a rabbinic prohibition because it is a communicative act based on the same spirit as halacha aleph. And that is this list of things of gesturing between the man and the woman, speaking in a lighthearted way between the man and the woman, smelling the perfume of the woman, hearing the voice, seeing the hair, all of that. So the Rambam is being very careful to kind of keep on using that image of kind of spheres of contact. If the goal is to establish a society where the Jewish sexual ethic is different than the non-Jewish sexual ethic, and that's Sefer Kedusha, 20 prakim are going to define the way in which actual sexual behavior in its most concrete sense, the way that that's manifested. But by chapter 21, here's the Torah's prohibition of contact that is sexual in nature, but not actually the act itself. And then halacha bet is going to be communicative action that is not written in the Torah, but is still in that spirit, and that's halacha bet. Yes?
Well, just because I know that this is going to get to the heart of the practical matter, but like hair and voice are not communicative action. They just are. Whereas making gestures and alluding to things, that's a communicative act. That is an active decision-making thing on the part of one, if not two people.
Right.
Whereas the existence or the mere existence of woman's hair or the necessary hearing of woman's voice to be bunched into that,
so I would,
speaking, is complicated.
Well, I would respond as follows. I definitely think that the hair question is true. I hear that. I think it's a little bit harder. The voice question, less so. There's an argument. Well, there's we can't really go through the sources now, but the Rambam seems to have thought, and this is in terms of our, we mentioned in the past how separate the societies were, how the community was in Islam, and how different it was than it was in Christian Europe. And the spoken voice seems to have been a problem as well. And that's, again, it's from the Gemara. The Gemara has two examples of Kol Isha, one which is unclear but assumed to be about singing, but one which is clear and is about speaking. And from the Rambam, it seems clear that it is about speaking. And if we actually are, and here's an example of how we can, if we look at the halacha as the Torah writes it, Tzarich Adam litrachek min hashim me'od me'od, and Kol Isha is an example. It's actually easy to understand what that's driving at, which is men and women should not speak to each other. And we have that kind of language within our halachic community, and part of our agenda is to try to see how you can kind of create a different kind of language around that community, around halachic language, and so I actually think that the voice part does really work. The hair part is a little bit more challenging, I think, in that regard.
I only argue the voice part because there's a different thing with a woman saying something provocative and a woman saying, "Can you please pass the salt?" Right? I mean, and in here, by grouping it together with communicative action, you're not differentiating between that. And I get what you're saying. So I think cultural relevance.
And the thing is yes, meaning their answer would be yes.
So it has to do with how suggestive you want to be. So to get back to Negiah, does it mean there's no problem with Negiah when it's not suggestive? There are social norms, and there are many countries where kissing is completely, it's not suggestive. It's how you say hello.
Well, that's where, right. So that's where we're headed. Yeah. Ultimately, that's where we're headed. Right. But it is important to recognize that that's kind of the point. That if the goal is to separate, then the goal is to separate absolutely. But if that is the goal, then we're not doing that. So if we're not doing that, either we're supposed to try to get back to that, or understand a different kind of way what the values are. And that's, I think, the challenge. And that opens up that kind of question. So but the goal in doing this is to then just kind of shift to how halacha yudchet is about shifvat zel vatala, wasting seed, and it's kind of, I'm going to leave it, it deserves its own analysis. Halacha yudtet talks about, and if you keep in mind, if you're holding in your head these kind of spheres of intensity, like what's the ultimate goal, what are the preventative measures to make sure that happens, then we are now going to take a step back in halacha yudtet, which is actually about self-arousal. A man this is talking to is not allowed to arouse himself, or to bring oneself to fantasy. So just thinking about that as a category, and thinking about the structure of the Rambam and how careful he is in the way that he's structuring it, and what the Torah essentially undoes in that sense, is that the first halachot are communicative actions and therefore fall under the Torah prohibition of lo tikrivu, or are Chazal's extensions of those communicative actions. Fantasy is a step before that, and that's not communicative, it's individual, and that also is a prohibition. Now, but if you follow the whole structure, it's basically saying, okay, you're not allowed to do that. The reason why that's a problem, kind of working backwards, is because that will lead to the thing before that, which will lead to the thing before that, which will lead to the thing before that. And therefore, the Rambam actually gives advice. You should move. The Torah is actually always the way to shift one's passions, focus for Chazal. It's like part of the idea of Talmud Torah, and for us it can be like intellectual pursuits in general. I mean, one can say, but certainly Talmud Torah in its own way is about shifting that kind of passion towards other kinds of pursuits. And so the end of the halacha talks about ways, positions that men should sleep in. Halacha Kaf says, not allowed to watch animals procreate. In order not, at the end it says, so that you're not, it won't result in hirhur. And here, here's where the laundry circumstance that the Gemara quotes, the Rambam brings it here. And thinking about the structure, it's actually, we can spend a little time thinking of a contemporary equivalent of what that might be. You can't, because if you're going to walk in an area where women are not going to be properly dressed, or they're going to be more exposed, then that might impact on you. Now here the question is, so when it says you're not allowed to do that, why are you not allowed to do that? Well, think of kind of the layers. You're not allowed to do that because it's going to bring to hirhur. Well, you're not allowed to do that because it's going to bring it to communication. You're not allowed to do that because that's going to bring to sexual action. You're not allowed to do that because it's going to lead to an actual sexual act. So there are circles of effect. At some point, the question then comes up, are all of these law, or are these preventative measures in order to make sure you don't violate the law? And how do you make that kind of distinction? In some sense, you'll forgive the poor analogy here, but I'll say, when I talk to kids, often laws around traffic actually make it easy because kids identify with kind of the difference between the spirit of the law and obeying the law. So, for example, it's clear that our responsibility is to make sure that the roads are safe. So there are red lights and green lights in order to make sure that people will obey those laws. If somebody looks both ways, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, there's nobody around, you say there's no one, and you just cross and the cop stops you and you say, there was nobody around, the reason for the law is to make sure I don't hit anybody, so it's really not a problem, you're going to get a ticket. And the reason you get a ticket is because that's the law. If an expecting couple, delivering couple is rushing to the hospital, by law they can get a ticket if they go through a red light, because you have to figure out means of transportation that's not going to violate the law. But we also have a sense that you're not allowed to cross against a red light for the same reason. But the cars are the dangerous, cause the danger, and the people a bit less so. And we know that the way that kind of jaywalking laws are implemented are a little bit different. You'll have environments where it's actually really strict and they'll give you tickets. And then there are places where, and then you have places where
it's actually really
if you're looking both ways and you know what the law is about, it might be on the books, but you're crossing the street anyway, that's not considered to be a violation of the law. And you can understand how it can go one way or another. The question that we have right now that the Rambam structure lends itself to really strongly, I think, is there a point, if something it says something is asur, is there like any personal agency that is allowed in these contexts, since this is in order to prevent this, in order to prevent this, or is it that's the law and once it's on the books, it's on the books? In the Torah, it's not a question. If it's about separating, it's about separating, and so all of them actually have an impact in terms of the separation. So with that in mind, I just want to read, if you can turn the page, I'm going to do a little bit quickly sources 5 and 6, because we have here two different approaches to that question. The Sefer HaChinuch on this mitzvah, and Sefer HaChinuch famously was written from a father to a son, on his reaching Gil mitzvot in order to direct him. So it goes through each mitzvah with the reason and its applications. It's written by one of the Rishonim, not exactly clear who. He writes as follows: Umikol makom l'fi adomeh shemikol ma she'ishiru zichronam levracha. It seems to me, based on everything that the rabbis warned in this regard, Ein Adam Rashai Lazuz Mi Musaram Hatov. A person is not prohibited to move, to stray from their musar, from the guidance that the rabbis gave. Afal Pishu Motzei Atzmo Chashuch Hata'ava Ktsat. And even if the person finds himself or herself Chashuch Hata'ava, Chashuch from Choshech, like dark, and Tava's desire. Chashuch Hata'ava means kind of depressed in terms of his sexual drive. Lo Yomar, you should not say, Kevan she'ani motzei atzmi kein, since I find myself in this way, it doesn't affect me. Ma ichbat li im istakel b'nashim. Why should it shouldn't bother me, because it doesn't make a difference to me if I'm looking at women. Ki yodea ani ba'atzmi shelo yitorer yitzri b'kach, because I know about myself that this is not going to be arousing to me. So the Sefer HaChinuch, he says to his son, writing, he says, you shouldn't say that. Because people say that, but they fail. It doesn't work. Which is actually interesting in its own right. So it's like, well, if he did that and he didn't fail, would he actually be doing something wrong or not? But what he's trying to say is, the musar is kind of a rule, and if you're wise, you're going to follow those rules as they're written. I'm going to point out again that following those rules as they're written, we don't actually do no matter whom we are in this co-ed community, we're not doing all these things as they're written, which I think kind of pokes a hole in it. But I think that somebody who wants to kind of go back to separate shopping hours, separate seating on buses and things like that, definitely has, right, that's where they're drawing from this kind of argument.
Yeah, just also the word musar is important here too. In other words, like he's recognizing in that word that what we're talking about is sort of a teaching and a worldview, and it's a very different word than saying the halacha, even though that is the halacha, but he's understanding this is communicating a worldview, and then maybe there is, like, within the question, he's admitting to some flexibility.
Also, like, I see as a parent to a child, how many times have you told someone, don't do that because you don't want them to? The Slurpees at 7-Eleven aren't kosher. Like, or other things that,
Right.
I really just don't want you to have them, and I don't want to get into it, just don't do this.
Yeah.
When really,
I know what's good for you.
Right. When really, like, when we're older, maybe we could talk more. But right now, no.
That analogy cuts, meaning it's a fair analogy, it cuts in both directions. At what point do you assume that you're, let's say, I'll say it like this: if God's telling you, you're a lifelong child in the face of, kind of God's command or the rabbi's command, or not. I mean, there's a certain sense of, okay, I'm an adult now, I can make that decision. That mindset is exactly what's at stake here. Like, do you have the right to say, I'm now an adult and I can actually think about this, differently, or not? That's a little bit about as to what's, what we're talking about. Now, the Gemara actually has a couple of examples where rabbis seem to think like that, to do action like that. I'll read one and quote another. The source in number 4 on top says, Rav Gidol have a ragil davik azil v'yativ ashare tefila. Rav Gidol, it was common for him, he would go and sit at the gate of the mikveh, and he would sit outside the mikveh. Amar lahu hachi tvili v'hachi tvili. He would give instruction to the women going in as to make sure about this or that, to make sure that their tvila in the mikveh was being done properly. Now, for us, we are consumed with ensuring privacy, and it doesn't seem appropriate for the rabbi to be sitting and doing that, which the rabbis called him on. Amri lei, although they didn't call him on the privacy for the women, they called him on his own Yetzirah. Amri lei rabbana lo kam mistafi mar Yetzirah. You're not worried about your Yetzirah. Amar lahu, he said to them, Damyan be'apai, they are similar to me, kikaki chivri, like white geese, which is a famous line in the Gemara, and if it strikes you as odd, it's just a line that's important to know, because as much as it is, I don't know, you can call it objectifying, call it whatever it is, however it is you want to refer to it, what it means is, it's not arousing to me, and therefore it's not a problem. That's one Gemara. There's another Gemara in Ketubot as an example. There are a couple of others besides this, which describes one of the Amoraim, I forgot who it is, who would take the kala at a wedding, would take the kala on his shoulders and dance with the kala on his shoulders, as the Gemara describes. And the Talmidim said, don't you think that's inappropriate? And he said, that dami alai kishura, that she's, to me, it's like carrying, same as a shura is like a beam of wood. Meaning I'm carrying, and it doesn't affect me, it's not impacting on me. So this actually is an example which suggests, both of these are examples which suggest that you might have strict rules, but then either they're violating the rules or the rules are subjective. Like, how do you manage that? So Sefer HaChinuch, the next paragraph says, if those rabbis, you shouldn't do it. The rabbis in the Gemara maybe can do it, which is one way of approaching it. The rabbis maybe can do it, you shouldn't do it, and that's his kind of cross-the-board rule. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read that inside, I'll just kind of say that. And so the Sefer HaChinuch in his teaching, is basically saying you should keep these rules across the board, although he seems to acknowledge that there is, it's a little bit more of an ethics than a law, but still he's saying you should be consistent about it.
Well, he also said something else interesting in the Rabbi inside, that like in those specific cases, it was also a case of a mitzvah. Meaning in those, but like it's not just that they were Amoraim and that they can do it and that the rest of us normal people can't, but like in those specific cases there was something about the particular situation which was, you know, akin to I'm going to learn Torah now and that's going to distract me, but this is a situation of a mitzvah and therefore that might put it in a different context.
Mm-hmm. That in contrast to a famous ritva that's at the end of Masechet Kiddushin. The Gemara in Kiddushin is talking about one of the things that's listed in Shulchan Aruch is that having women serve men. Ein mishtamshim b'isha, the Gemara says. A man is not permitted to use a woman, which means, and there's a discussion again, the Rishonim and in Halacha as to exactly what that means, but there's certain services that if a woman performs for a man, that's considered intimate and problematic. Whether this is, kind of their classic examples are either setting a bed, preparing a bed, the woman for the man, pouring wine. Those are the classic examples because there's a level of intimacy to that. And at the end, the Gemara makes a comment, and there's an exchange in the Gemara, but the Gemara says, "Kol shem shamayim," that it should be l'shem shamayim, and then the Ritva comments on that. What does it mean, "Kol shem shamayim"? So the Ritva says, "V'chein hilchata." This is the halacha. Da kol kfi masha adam makir ba'atzmo. It really depends on what a person recognizes within himself. If it's necessary to distance oneself, oseh, should. If you look at this formulation, he says, as an example, if it's necessary to do that which the Gemara said, not to look at the clothing of women, because otherwise it is arousing, then that's what the person should do. But that formulation says that because that is the prohibition that leads to hirhur, which leads to interaction, the thing which leads to hirhur is a judgment call. The hirhur is a problem. The thing that leads to hirhur is a decision al fi ma sh'adam makir ba'atzmo. V'im makir ba'atzmo sheyitzro nichna. But if you know that your drive is under control, the kafuflo, ve'in ma'aletina doesn't cause this drive. Mutarlo listakel u'ledaber im ha'erva. One is permitted to look at and to speak to an erva, v'lish'ol b'shlom eshet ish, and to send regards, and to establish, to communicate with an eshet ish. And he brings as an example Rabbi Yochanan, the yasiv ashari tefillah v'lechai she'etzahara, the example of Rabbi Yochanan who would sit by the mikveh. Rav Ada bar Ahava she'amru b'ktuvo tenakat kala kitvei v'rakid ba, and Rav Ada bar Ahava who danced with the kala. Now, so that actually is a very different kind of approach. It's saying there are behaviors that if in the context it doesn't, either because of social context or because of the way the individual knowing himself or herself doesn't cause hirur, that's not a problem. Then, of course, it's almost like you expected. At the end, the Ritva then turns around and says, "El she'ein ra'ui lakel b'zeh el chassid gadol shemakir ba'atzmo." But you should only rely on this if you're a great chassid. V'lo kol talmidei chachamim bodchim b'yitzreihem. Not every talmid chacham should really rely or trust that it's okay. It is important to note that in Shulchan Aruch on these halachot, the Piskei Tshuva, which is a commentary on quotes the different achronim actually quote this Ritva, which suggests that it's kind of part of the discourse. And we're going to leave it and then hand it off to Schlaff is at this point, which is basically to say that if there are these circles and the ultimate goal is to create a certain kind of a sexual ethic in the community and a responsive, and there are kind of spheres, and the more we can all be, when we look at it that way, first of all, we can say, we actually have, these rules work. It's actually, we're pretty good, we have a pretty good ethic overall as communities go. But then as the expectations get higher and higher, then people start to fall off. That's where our society goes. Then you say, oh, that actually makes sense. And then once it starts to make sense, then I think it opens up the possibility of taking it overall more seriously, but also trying to pay attention to where, like the idea of being careful about hirhur seems like it's valid and thoughtful to pay attention to that kind of thing. But then it shifts from being just about laws to being about, well, how do I actually implement them, and is there a space in terms of being able to be a functional member of society in order to be able to kind of implement them in a certain way? Yeah.
But so I'm having a hard time just getting past something where you said with the structure and the Rambam pulling out, because I think if you ask the average, certainly teenager or anyone who went through the teenage process in the Orthodox world, they would think that the center prohibition is the wasting of seed.
Right.
Like that the issue is mostly boys should not be wasting seed, men should not be wasting seed, and all of this goes to that. Whereas Rambam puts that at 18.
So that's not a question. Thank you for saying that, because there is a guy in Israel, his name is Shiloh Pachter. He wrote a dissertation on the wasting of seed in Jewish, and in his section on the Rambam, I mean, a big part of the argument is to say this idea, the wasting seed part of the argument has its own history, and it's not necessarily kind of original to the text, although it certainly is kind of very present and is a value in Judaism. And he's not saying it isn't a factor. But when he reads the Rambam, based on seeing how carefully the Rambam structures the text, that's exactly his point. He says it's pretty clear that wasting of seed is not the issue.
And when that becomes the center issue, it sort of it obfuscates so many other issues and practices and raises the level of things that.
That's exactly what we're driving
Yeah.
at. Yes, exactly that.
Okay,
And so that ends up shifting.
Right.
And I think
You
that
talk about an internal ethic and what
Yeah.
your own thoughts should be and how that affects you, and it's not just about an action, and then it applies to men and women in similar ways, and it's not different, and all those things are significant.
everything, once you make that move, then a lot of things start to subtly, right? But a lot of things start to shift around in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and what are the things that are important in order
But
to be able
that
to get
becomes
to
a
that.
really interesting conversation to have with the teenagers, because you're putting the center back where it belongs and sort of realigning. I mean, even that in and of itself becomes a really interesting starting point to talk to these kids and make it more relevant.
Exactly.
Because once it's all about seed, it's like irrelevant from the
Right.
get-go. It's almost impossible to make it relevant to a teenager.
Mhm. Okay, there it is.
All
Okay.
right. Well then.
Segue.
I want to add one thing to that, and that is, but what we see around them is very much the opposite. Those they see and they hear a lot of the wasting seed and women's responsibility for that, as especially with the emphasis on clothing, etc. That it serves a very it's very negative.
That's exactly my point.
It's very negative to them.
So that's why the Tzrichim Lizaher Min Anashim Me'od Me'od also fosters that women kind of separating type of thing. And part of what is of interest to us is to shift the focus back onto the person, meaning whether it's a male or female, to manage his or her own hirhur, and then to take ownership over that and figure out how to be able to manage that. So shifting away from the female performance and the seed to the individual's mindset, mental mindset, and taking ownership over his behavior.
And just to stress again, then in that case, then the individual is can be a female also in terms of responsibility for sexual ethics and thoughts, and it really creates a whole different kind of conversation.
Right, because the seed does the same thing. It's all about the guy.
Yeah.
It's not about.
Right. Okay. So we're gonna shift. Well, that was actually a really great segue into this, because what we're gonna do now is talk a little bit practically about how does this idea of can we assume that people have some sense of personal agency in controlling sexual thoughts? How does that play out actually in particular situations? And the particular situation that we're going to talk about is going to the beach. So I'm going to just actually, before we look, we're going to look at a tshuva of Rav Moshe, but based on sort of this conversation that we are having now, if you would just answer that, right? According to what we've seen, what we've thought, can a guy go to a beach? Can a woman go to a beach?
Possibly.
Possibly. Okay, the possibly is from where?
I like to swim. Other people like to swim. It has nothing to do with me looking at their bodies or any kind of rub. There's the possibilities.
Okay, so is it possible, right? Is it possible to say that I can go to a beach and control whatever my sexual thoughts may be?
No.
And so that's the one side of it. You're clearly on the other side of it, which is
Right. Some of those bathing suits, honestly and truly, you can't not look at it.
okay. So the other side is
You go to the beach and you see men running off
Right.
for the need of privacy every 5 seconds just because a woman walks by.
No, but they're running in the water a lot.
Well, I mean,
It
people
depends.
seem to.
okay.
Manage.
People do go to the beach, right?
People
There's a
go to the
reality.
beach.
People go to the
Right.
beach, and there are
Right.
people,
There's
and there are
certainly-
interactions there that are not sexual interactions. Okay,
There's
so
certainly a different level of tzniut issue for women to walk around in a bathing suit at the beach as opposed to on the street.
right. I'm assuming right now, even forget how you're going dressed to the beach, right? Just can you take a stroll on the beach? Let's say in
Well, there's
full
the argument
appropriate
to be
dress,
made.
right?
If you're in full appropriate dress with your skirt to the ankles on the beach, are you not causing more attention to be brought to yourself than the person who's dressed like everybody else?
Interesting. Interesting.
Like, if you are less able to fade into the background, are you causing? I mean,
Interesting.
I wonder about that.
Okay, I hear that. That's the Burkini argument or whatever it was. But so Rav Moshe, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
This is all a matter of time. 100 years ago, something was acceptable, or you agreed or could understand. But today, given the world in which we live, it's no longer relevant.
Okay.
Yeah.
The standards.
Good.
change.
So that's also so the question of what we've become accustomed to. We're actually going to deal with that a bit more next time than this time. But the question of what are we accustomed to, and how our own community's sort of modulation of sexuality, and what has changed, and what kind of thoughts that might lead to are going to be different now than they were 100 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever it is. Okay. And are we trying to the halachic question is, does that matter? Are we trying to kind of go back to a certain time? Do we want to preserve some of that? So we're going to talk about that as well. Rav Moshe was asked in 1960 whether a man can go to a beach, and we're gonna take a look at his tshuva. Before we take a look at his tshuva is very much based on a Gemara in Bava Batra. So we're going to read through the Gemara in Bava Batra first, and take a look at a tshuva of Rav Moshe, and hopefully we will also have time to take. No, we're not going to have time to do that today. We'll do that next time. Okay, Gemara in Bava Batra. Pasuk says, "V'otseim einav." This is source number 7. "V'otseim einav meraot bira." Okay, so the pasuk is praising somebody who hides his eyes. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba. How do we interpret this pasuk? So we've talked about this laundry issue a lot, right? What does it mean that we are praising a man who hides his eyes? This is somebody who does not look at women when they are doing the laundry. Again, they're doing the laundry by the river. They're have to lift up their clothing or it's clingy. And then the Gemara says, well, wait a second. We don't understand that. What's so great about this? Heichi dami. What's the specific situation in which we would want to praise a man who averts his eyes from a woman who is doing laundry? If there was another way that he could go, in other words, why is he kind of walking by in the first place? Rashahu, right? If he could have taken that path, and he said he deliberately went this way by the river, so even if he's averting his eyes, why are we praising him? He could have taken the path and avoided the situation to begin with. Idalega darka achrita, anosu. But if there wasn't any other way that he could go, then he was forced into that situation to begin with, so he's forced in the situation. Why are we praising him? La'olam delega darka achrita, right? Oh, so what was the situation, says the Gemara? There wasn't any other way to go. Okay? Va'afilu hachi Mi baile lemenas nafshe. What did this guy do that was praiseworthy?
He looked away.
He looked away. In other words, did he really have to look away? Maybe he didn't really have to look away, but we're going to praise him because he looked away.
That's
Okay.
the whole parenting ethic in and of itself. Do you praise the child for doing what they're supposed to do? Even though, like, you're like, yeah, you're supposed to do that, right?
Right.
Like, are you proud of me that you did?
I think
what
the
you're
answer to that is
supposed
always yes.
to? Right?
In my little bit of experience.
Like, I'm like, yeah, of course, like, obviously he should avert his eyes, but you should still praise the guy for doing the right thing.
Right. It is like a very interesting. It's interesting the Gemara even asked that question.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating question, and it's even more interesting, kind of where halachic sources go with this little piece of Gemara. Okay, so let's just actually go straight into the Tshuva of Moshe. So the Tshuva of Moshe is actually really first asked whether going to the beach is Yehareg Ba'al Yavor. Okay, what does he mean? Just so that contextually we understand this, right? What does that mean that going to the beach is Yehareg Ba'al Yavor? The three things that you are supposed to, if somebody puts a gun to your head and says, you know, do this Avera or I'll kill you. So there are three things for which you are supposed to die, right? Shvichut Damim, Gilei Arayot, Avodah Zarah. So the question is going to the beach as part of the Isur of Lo Tikruvu Lagalo Erva, is that considered something that would also be Yehareg V'Yavor, because it's part of this, like, this will lead to this will lead to this, okay? In the end, without going through all the mechanics of how Moshe gets there, Moshe says, no. This is not part of that conversation, right? What are we actually talking about here? And it's not part of, it is not considered Yehareg V'Yavor. We are talking about the Isur of V'nishmarta b'kol davara, and we're talking about the categories of hirhur and histaklit. Those are not categories that are in the conversation of lo tikruvu. In other words, this is like a step before that, which then gets Rav Moshe to talking about the question of, okay, let's talk about hirhur and histaklit at a beach. Okay, and that's where he goes. So if you take a look at that second paragraph there, on source number 8, we're just going to start where it says Matzino b'Bava Batra. Matzino b'Bava Batra daf nun zayin. שאמר רבי חייא בר אבא על קרא דבעוצי בעיניו מראות ברע, זה שאם מסתכל בנשים בשעה שעומדות על הכביסה. Right? So that was the Gemara. ולמה מזקיקו הכתוב להעצים עיניו? עיין שם. ולכאורה נהי דלגה דרכה אחריתה אינו אנוס. דרי אפשר לו שלא ללך כלל לשם. ואף שצריך ללך לשם לפרנסתו ולעבודתו לשאר צרכיו, מה בכך? Ha-ones mamon, eno ones litchot isurin. What is Rav Moshe saying here? He's really bothered by something in the Gemara, okay? This is what Rav Moshe is saying here. What's so great? Why are we even praising him for kind of averting his eyes? Maybe he didn't have to go there at all. Maybe the guy should have just stayed home, okay? And then he says, oh, you're going to tell me that this is an issue of parnasah. You're going to tell me that he had to go there because he has to make money. Since when do we say that just because, like if this is a real isur, and we're going to be totally serious about this, since when do we say, okay, because of your parnasah, you can be over an avera, right? We don't really say that unless it's like a life or death kind of situation. This is not a life or death kind of situation, and so why would it be okay for this guy to even walk by there, even if he is averting his eyes, okay? Which then gets Rav Moshe to a place of saying, hey, we need to actually really reconsider what the Isur of Vinishmarta is, what type of Isur is this hirhur and histaklut, and then start talking about individual control a little bit. So let's keep reading. V'lachein, tzarich lomar, dekevan deha'isur hu rak mishum chashash sheyavo lidei hirhur. Why is a man not allowed to look at women on a beach, let's say? Because it might lead, that histaklut might lead to hirhur, fantasy, right? He says, well, in that situation, because it's a sin where we're worried about another sin, rishai lismoch al atzmo she'asiach da'ato mehen v'lo yaharher machmat she'yistakel behen. Maybe in that situation, we could say that a person could depend upon himself, right? And here he's really talking about himself, that he would change his thoughts. He would not focus on it so much, right? right? If for some reason, for the case of parnasah, for the case of livelihood, a man needed to be in a place where women were dressed inappropriately, you could say that because the isur is an isur where we're just worried about something leading to something else, that we can say that an individual has personal agency and would be able to control his thoughts, and histakla wouldn't, like, you can break the link between histakla and hirhur. Okay, it wouldn't necessarily lead to one, it wouldn't necessarily lead to the other.
Just to continue this idea, because this is really all about shifting focus, like you talked about earlier. This is the same. So the idea here then becomes not about who's wearing what and who's going where, but ultimately about
Your own control.
but specifically
right.
about fantasy. And now, whether it's possible or the challenges to control that is something we should talk about and talk about next. But we all have kind of this gut that as an ethic, or at least trying to manage that, is something that is something that should be managed, and that the halakha is addressing that is not problematic. The thought that shifting the focus back to that and away from some other things is, I think, part of what's happening here, which I think is really important.
Right,
and you can own that.
Yeah, just to also make that clear, that it says it's not the woman's fault for like dressing in a bikini on the beach, right? It's not like, oh, she's causing the man. It becomes about the man then controlling his own thoughts and feelings, okay, which is a significant shift here. But let's read a little bit more and see what Rav Moshe actually says, and then we'll kind of take a step back and see and talk about his thoughts. Sure.
Maybe the fact that we're talking about his parnasah, maybe it's not really only for his need to make money, but also because this is his job, he got used to it, this certain amount of immunity. And just like we get used to things, we go to the beach a lot, or if you grew up in France and the beach, the women are completely nuts, and you kind of become immune to things, and so things don't.
So interestingly, I think one could say that. Rav Moshe does actually not say that at all. It's very interesting. It's actually, I think, a glaring, and I think he doesn't say that because he really doesn't believe that. In other words, I think there's a certain sense to which we'll see it inside, but he actually doesn't go the route at all of we're more used to that and therefore it's not going to affect the man. That's not what Rav Moshe wants to do, right? Rav Moshe wants to keep this ethic of sexual stuff should affect us, right? And it shouldn't be that we are in a situation in which we're just blasé, used to going to the beach and seeing people in various, states of undress, right? He doesn't want to say that that's okay or we're used to that. He just wants to say that sometimes, not on a societal level, on a communal level, but sometimes an individual, when necessary, can control his thoughts. That's where he's kind of going.
But the argument that he uses to even get there is a little strange, only in the sense that he's basically saying that if you're going to take the halacha seriously, it means you can't go anywhere near the women doing the laundry, even if you have a good reason to be there, even if you avert your eyes. Which is like a whole other level that isn't even brought up. That's what he's saying. Like, if you're going to really do this, that means you can't be anywhere near the vicinity, and you don't even deserve praise if you're forced to be there and you look away. Like, that's an extremity that I don't
Meaning,
even think
if the
they're
person's
wrong.
going to violate, if the person's going to end up
No,
having
because
fantasy.
if you read the Gemara Baba Batra says the guy walked where he wasn't necessarily supposed to walk, and he averts his eyes, so we praise him, and they debate whether or not he deserves praise. But then Rav Moshe Feinstein says, not only does he not deserve praise, but he shouldn't have been there, and even though he averts his eyes.
No, that's where he's saying. He's saying first, why would he deserve praise? Well, maybe it's because, he's saying the Gemara doesn't make sense unless you say that it is, that's the piece. That's his first piece. In other words, the Gemara is not going to make sense because if you just leave it as the Gemara, unless you say that the guy shouldn't have been there at all, but that's not what Moshe thinks. Moshe thinks it's not that the guy shouldn't have been there at all. It's okay that the guy was there, and we are praising him for averting his eyes.
Right, but it is true that if the person was such that he would have hirhur based on where he's going, and the fact that it's normal or regular or his job or whatever is not a factor. He's supposed to take that seriously because it's usser.
Right.
So then that's part of what it means to own it.
And that's what's really interesting about what he does. Is let's read a little more and then we'll take the step back. Okay, so just continuing there. Right? You don't have to be too worried about this to an extent in which it's going to cause a financial loss. Only when it's not necessary for you to be there, right? Only if it's not necessary for you to be at the beach, right? Right? In a situation in which there is another path or another way for you to go. V'hu hadin k'she'ein lo tzorech lelech l'sham, right? This is the halacha if you don't have a reason to be there. Dolech rak l'tayel. She'af v'lega darka achrita hu asur l'smoch al atzmo she'asiach data. Right? If you're just going to the beach and you say, I want to wake up on a Sunday because it's a beautiful day in May or whatever it is, and I want to go to the beach, and Rav Moshe is very clear, right? And says, when can you lean on yourself and say, maybe I can have some personal agency, maybe I can control your thoughts? Only if you absolutely need to. Okay, but if you don't absolutely need to, right? Let's say you need to go to the beach for a medical reason. Then you really need to. Or let's say you need to walk somewhere where there are women who are not dressed appropriately, right? Then you need to. But if you're just doing it just for fun, right? Then we don't say in those situations, oh, I'm not going to have her. Or I'm not going to, or his sakla isn't necessarily going to lead to the her. So he allows like for a little bit of self-control, but only in situations in which it's totally and absolutely necessary, not for having fun, entertainment, recreation. And then just that last line there, right? There is this yisur v'nishmarta, and that doesn't mean that you're supposed to totally rely on yourself. But if it is necessary, then you can, because we're talking about an isur, that it's an isur that this will lead to that, and if you absolutely need to, you can break that chain. So I think what Rav Moshe is doing here is actually really interesting, and I want to just appreciate a big picture what he's doing here, right? What's he saying? There's histaklut and there's hirhor, and those are real things. And he wants to preserve those as real things. He doesn't want to say, oh, society has changed and everything is different now, right? And that it's not a real thing. On the other hand, Rav Moshe is also saying, right, there's a real need to kind of interact with the world within which we live, and you can't totally separate yourself from a society. And we're going to see, he's going to say later on, like, you can't say, like, you're mostly living on the Lower East Side, your constituency is all working in Manhattan, right? You can't tell people that they can't go to work in Midtown during the summer, right? So what's he saying? He's basically saying, like, you have to live within the world. So how does he keep, like, you got to live in the world, and you also have to maintain a sensitivity to sexual matters, and her and his histaklut are real. So the way he does that is with this bridge of saying, well, sometimes in certain situations, b'makom tzorech, a person can have a certain degree of personal control and agency. Okay, which is a really interesting way, I think, of balancing those ideals. So let's stop here for a second, just on that. Thoughts, comments, reactions.
I just find it interesting that in the more Haredi community, you see a lot of women who decide not to go to the beach or to go in a very tzniut way, but men don't stop going. When clearly from this, it's the responsibility is on them. The isur is on them.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah. That's just true. Makes no sense.
I mean,
yeah.
What we do.
A lot of
Even
times people
feminine,
just yeah. I think, you know, if I would think about like what Rav Moshe is trying to do here and kind of fast forward it, like in terms of the value balance that he's trying to strike, and fast forward that, you know, almost 60 years since this tshuva was written, and think about examples of, and again, trying to think about this in terms of thinking about teenagers, right? Like we live in a certain world, there are ads all over the place, right? Do we want to say to kids like, oh, it doesn't matter, you see all these ads, and you know, I was in a carpool recently with my friend's 11-year-old son, and there are these like huge trucks going over the George Washington Bridge with like Kim Kardashian, you know, totally like splayed all over the truck, and like he's like, hey, why are there naked women on trucks, right? And like, do we want to just say, oh, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal, or do we want to actually help kids figure out like how do you have a sensitivity to that, but also say, this is the world in which we live, and you want to make a big deal of it, but you don't want to make too much of a big deal of it. And I think it's really complicated. And what Rav Moshe is doing here is really interesting in terms of that balance of, we want to keep a society in which we're sensitive to these things still. And I think that value is a really significant and important value. We also want to say that people can control their thoughts.
Well, I think it also is interesting because underneath what Rav Moshe is saying is a notion of where the mind is at the time. So if your mind is on responsibilities, if your mind is on things that you need to do, there is better ability to control your thoughts. Whereas if your mind is on fun and
100%.
on self-enjoyment,
100%.
then your mind is on self-enjoyment, and you literally have no way of controlling where self-enjoyment leads you. So it's actually not just about society either. It's also still about that personal agency and the recognition of
100%.
human,
So I actually
human frailty, I guess you would say.
Good. I want to actually end with, I want to read like the two pieces in bold here of Moshe, which is, he says, if you keep going, right, in the book, "She'achol atzominav midina enu mechuyav." He says, even if you could look away in that kind of situation, let's say you have to be at the beach, and you have to be at the beach because for medical reasons you have to be at the beach, right? You can control yourself. And Rav Moshe says, actually, it's a really lovely thing to avert your eyes if you can, but he says you actually don't have to. כיוון שהוא דבר קשה לפניו, ורק ממידת חסידות יש לו למנס נפשו לעצום עיניו. Okay? So it's kind of very interesting, right? He says you actually don't have to look away. If you're somebody who you have to be there because you have to be there, you don't actually have to go to the extent of saying, right, because that gets back to the Gemara. What are we doing? We're praising the person for looking away. So you don't actually have to look away. And then a little bit later on, I'm not going to see this inside just for the sake of time, but Rav Moshe basically makes the point that, and this is along the lines of what you were saying, we can't legislate that people can't like walk on the streets, right? You can't have a world in which people are not walking on the streets. So therefore we have to say people are walking on the streets. And then he says, well, how do you walk on the streets and not focus on these things? Well, you walk on the streets and you're not focused on these things because what are you doing when you're walking on the street? You're trying to get where you're going, right? That's your mindset. You're just trying to like walk in Midtown Manhattan, and that's actually what he's talking about, right? You're trying to make sure that you're shaloya yuzak, right? You're trying to make sure that you're not actually hurt when you're walking. So how do you do that? You adopt a certain mindset where you're focused on one thing and you're not focused on the sexuality.
What was the Shiloh?
So the Shiloh
was it about going to the beach? Because then why does Rav Moshe go into walking on the street? Like it's kind of interesting way to go. Like,
on the street.
The
like
Shiloh was about going to the beach. But the interesting,
like why are you answering the question?
But it really
For medical, for medical reasons. And like a guy needed to go and had no other place to go,
a
separate beach to go to.
Commentary that he chooses
because he's talking about saying about
living in the world when it's a fairly simple question, like, can I go to the beach if I'm a Hatzalah person and somebody passes out? The answer is yes, because of this, this, and this. But then you also go off and say, well,
he does say, right, yeah, he does kind of say, because we're not going to talk now about Lo Tikravu, like, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about Hirur and Histaklut and what those categories are, which means for him, a man looking at a woman in,
But it's just an interesting statement on how to make a tshuva, because, like, if you hadn't read this and you weren't interested in reading a tshuva on whether or not I can go to the beach for medical reasons, you might not ever know this notion of this philosophy. I mean, so it's an interesting place to stick it.
Yeah. Although it makes
It's
one does follow from the other.
It's a logical extension, but it's just an interesting. This is a fairly big statement.
Right. So what we're going to do, 100%. What we're going to do next time is actually we're going to look at a contrasting tshuva from Rabbi Yosef, who's actually in dialogue and in response to Rav Moshe's tshuva, and has a kind of a different take on it, which is really interesting. But just to sort of reiterate what we talked about today, this idea of what Rav Moshe is doing is allowing for some degree of individual control. But only really b'makom tzorach, but a real bowing to sort of, we have to live in the world, and that's kind of how he gets to that distinction. And we'll talk a little bit more next time about what this means for us nowadays.
But the individual control exists again only in the categories. I think that the shift of focus to not the behaviors of whether you go to the beach or hear the woman sing or whatever as being the categories, but the categories are his Hirur and Histaklut is where the focus is supposed to be, and those are actually really prohibited. So the question of personal agency is on the things that might lead to that Hirur and Histaklut is where the space exists, perhaps, to be able to make those decisions.
I wonder what Rav Moshe would say on going to museums. You don't have to go to the museum. You're not going to the museum to get somewhere, but you're living in the world, and it's part of, culture, and you're seeing suggestive.
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
That's a good example. I think there are lots of examples you could think of, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank
See you next week.
you.